I'm going to, thank you. So I'm going to invite you up in just a minute, but let me introduce you. Devin Sean, D.S. Moss, is a Humanist Chaplain and Webby award-winning storyteller, unwavering in his pursuit to relate stories that connect us to our humanity. A natural explorer, he uses playful inquisition to examine the complexity of the human condition and the intrinsic meaning of life. Moss maintains an interdisciplinary practice of storytelling, street philosophy, and practical altruism, as well as humanism. So I welcome Devin up here. Okay, and, oh, you know what, I think which do you prefer?
This is fine.
Good. You're
This
good
is
with
fine.
that?
Yeah.
Terrific. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Comfortable?
Yeah, this is great.
Great. Okay. So Devin and I have known each other for a number of years. We've had conversations on Zoom, at my dining room table, on phone. And so I invited you to be the first Humanist Chaplain in this series. For a lot of reasons, partly because you live here in Brooklyn, but also because you've been doing some very important work as a Humanist Chaplain in an area that people may not realize there is a calling and a need. So I'd like you to tell us what you've been doing lately, and I know that you've spoken about it quite a bit, and he had a wonderful write-up about your work in the New York Times almost a year ago.
Yeah.
So please tell us about that work that you're doing.
Yeah, so what you're referring to is last year I was the spiritual care advisor for a man named Philip Hancock, who was executed by the state of Oklahoma. And so for the entirety of that year, we spoke on the phone and developed a relationship, ultimately so that I, as a chaplain, could accompany him in the execution chamber.
What was that like for you? I mean, I'm wondering, did he originally identify as a humanist? How did you two get connected?
Yeah, Phil identified as a rational nihilist, is what he would claim, and so the process, particularly in Oklahoma, but I would say this is true for most states, is the assumption is that the chaplain will be Christian chaplain. And not even a variation of other types of religion. It is a particular brand of Christianity, in Middle America. And so Phil did not want to be preached to. Phil did not, in that way, need his soul to be saved, because again, I think the primary objective of a chaplain, typically in the corrections assigned, at least in death row, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush there, is to, in those final moments, to save souls and to offer, or to provide space to admit or to make sure that the pathway either to heaven or to hell has been cleared through the Word of God. And Phil did not see the world in that way. He did not want to be evangelized to, which was often the case. And so he went out looking for a non-theist chaplain. And there's not too many of us out there. No. So he had slim pickings. And so his attorneys reached out to me and asked if it was something that I would be willing to do. And over the process of a couple weeks, we wrote some letters back and forth and had a phone call to see if it was a good fit, for lack of a better term. And so we decided to both say yes and walk that path together.
You mentioned the role of the chaplain and how it's, at least in your experience of the prison system, is different than it might be in other venues. And certainly we were both trained as chaplains, and I served in 3 universities as chaplain. You've also served in different settings. So we know from our training that it's not about proselytizing, it's not about saving souls. Even if you come from that kind of tradition, the training, theoretically, ideally, is very different. So maybe you can share with our folks what that training was like for you.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll start even further back to even how we first met and how I became a chaplain to begin with, because I think for me, the main obstacle in this journey was doubt. And as the podcast that was referenced earlier, like, I am a card-carrying skeptic, and I think skepticism, if used right, is a superpower. At least was my superpower. Like this way to lead with curiosity and interrogate the world in a way that is scalable, I guess I would say. And so what was interesting then, when I was on the path to chaplaincy, doubt was something different. Doubt was a reflection of insecurity. Doubt was something that was very personal. Skepticism, you can have an arm's length of, like, I can be skeptical of all of this, but doubt is something that one wrestles with internally with themselves. So that precursor is because being a chaplain makes no sense. I mean, being a chaplain that doesn't believe in God, I thought, didn't make any sense. And so it all started. I was interviewing for this podcast, and mortality was the theme of the show. And so I was doing this subsection on religious beliefs in the afterlife, because in all of my experiences as getting to be known as the death guy, the question that people would ask me the most frequently was, what do you think happens after we die? And I always thought that was such an interesting question, as related to one's mortality, is what happens next? And so I thought, well, let me explore that topic. And so I was interviewing a Zen Buddhist about her beliefs in, or sort of speaking on behalf of Buddhism, of what's next. And we had a lovely conversation, and she was one of these types of people that you meet that you feel like you've known for the entirety of your life. And she said, you would make a good chaplain, after the end of our conversation. And I said, impossible. I don't believe in God. And then the next person I interviewed for the same series was Aman Latif, who had an office right next door to you. And then he mentioned you and Humanist Chaplain. And I was like, what is this Humanist Chaplain thing you speak of? So I looked up Anne, gave her a ring, and then I talked to Greg Epstein at Harvard, MIT, and the next thing you know, I'm at Meadville Theological School. I was in flow. All of that is to say is that, so once I graduated school, I went to CPE at Bellevue Hospital, and this is during the pandemic, and this doubt came up again. This doubt of my cohort, there was a Carmelite monk, there was a Catholic priest, there was a Southern Baptist, there was a Nazarene, there was an imam there as well, and so here's a humanist. Where do I fit in the spiritual care world when visiting patients? And I would constantly sort of try to stay open and question how I can show up. And what I soon realized was this openness, this ability to always be questioning, is a way to keep you present. Because in my first unit at CPE, I mean, guess what would happen when these other faith systems would walk into a patient's room? They carry the whole tradition, thousands of years, into the room with them. And more often than not, the patient or the care seeker doesn't need 1,000 years of tradition, right? They need someone in the room with them to help them in the moment, with their spirituality sort of widely, defined.
I'm just going to explain a couple of things that you mentioned that folks may not know. So Meadville Lombard, that's a Unitarian Universalist seminary that also has some humanist tradition. And for a time, what had been the Humanist Institute and later became the Center for Education, under the umbrella of the American Humanist Association, was in partnership with Meadville Lombard Seminary to provide humanist education. So that's part of what he was involved in. CPE is clinical pastoral education. And there are different lines to study that. So you did this in terms of a hospital setting. When I did it in a university setting. But that's part of that training where, fortunately, you get to meet people from other traditions. And yes, I agree. My colleagues would often, if they didn't physically bring it in with them, you felt like they were carrying thousands of years of a tradition. And I think, I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, in studying how to become a humanist chaplain or ethical culture clergy leader, learning about the history of humanism throughout humankind was very helpful, because then I felt like, oh, I can walk in the room with that too, but I don't need to put it on display.
Right, right. I mean, it is a subtle thing to have
Yeah.
in your tool belt or your back pocket for sure. Yeah.
I wanted to dig in a little bit because I think you came to a lot of people's attention through the podcast on death and mortality. And it's just fascinating. I know that you interviewed me at one time on that as well. What drew you to that? And are you still working on that? And are you still interviewing people around the topic of death and mortality? And
I always like to say that when I was born, I came out of the womb saying why instead of wah. So I was born with a bit of an existential curiosity, let's say. And so it was kind of a bit of a lark or whim. This is 2015. Serial had just come out and took the world by storm. And I worked in media, and I said to a friend who was a sound mixer, I'm like, hey, let's do a passion project. And I just really sort of tongue-in-cheek said, let's try to find the meaning of life through the end of it. Not thinking I could get more than 10 episodes, but it was one of these things where you talk to one person about mortality in some form, and then it leads to something else, and then it leads to something else, and the next thing you know, 8 years later, I'm still having these fascinating conversations about the myriad of ways that death influences life. However, I'm not doing it anymore. I think I may have transitioned out of that. But I still love the topic, and I was at a dinner party last night, and it wasn't 5 minutes before we were already talking about death. So it is something that I think, and it's also a topic, to be quite honest, that I think that as a culture and as a society, we should be having more and better conversations about death.
And I think since you did that podcast, the things have changed, or things have become. We've been able to talk about it more in our world. For example, the Death Cafe came over from England. We did that at the New York Society for many years. The Death Cafe is folks getting together and talking about their own death and about the notion of death while they have tea and scones, because it did come from England, and also an opportunity for people to put a package together. Make sure my will is in order. Make sure I have an ethical will. Make sure that my children who don't want to listen to me about this know that I do have plans. And also death doulas. We've heard a lot about birthing doulas. A few years now, there have been something called death doulas. I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago in the DC area with both somebody from a death cafe and a death doula, having a feedback conversation about a play that happened to be about the death of a child. So I think having more of that out there helps those conversations. I think you helped with that.
Well, thank you. I think however these things can be surfaced, I think the more important it is. And just to maybe even to take it back to society now is that what Sheldon Solomon in his book Worm at the Core has proven through Ernest Becker's denial of death is that sort of when death is made salient subconsciously, people tend to then gravitate to their cultural worldviews and then become more isolated. So I thought at the beginning, that if one became aware either subconsciously or consciously of death in some way, then we'd be like, oh, it's going to happen to us all. We're all going to then drop the BS and be more loving humans. That was my theory. That's not scientifically proved to be untrue. And so I think when, conversely, if we can actually meditate on it, at least 5 minutes a day, it sort of relieves that built up anxiety so that then we don't get attached, we don't sort of double down on our cultural worldviews, because what happens with that is then we begin to other quite quickly.
And that is still part of our Western culture, isn't it? That strong, Ernest Becker, that strong denial of death, and that we kind of live in that place where we're denying it rather than not necessarily embracing it, but acknowledging it and recognizing this is something we all have in common.
Yeah, exactly. And I think some of the ways that it does, ripple out into society is you think about it in terms of like finitude. I would say that culturally, America in particular has a big problem with accepting finality of something or a limited supply of something. We are sort of taught that, it's economic growth, 2.5%, 3% every year, this sort of exponential, this limitlessness. Resources will always be there, water will always be there. And so if we could actually switch it to be like, things are finite, then they become more valuable and more important in how we actually, either use them or steward them. It makes all the difference. And so that's why I think it's important to, at least in the podcast, what we try to do is this hypothesis is that if we were to start at our own end, then that should sort of allow us to live in the most meaningful way possible. And it's in my head, it's a little bit more nuanced than just carpe diem. It's not like I'm going to live today as though it's my last. It's like I have a limited time. How am I going to live each remaining day? And I think that's why organizations, or just humanism, aligns with that for me. How do I want to live the rest of my life?
And it's so much about living in the present, isn't it? I mean, I think you said you started off speaking to somebody who was a Buddhist and then came around to humanism. Buddhism, like ethical culture or humanism, is a non-theistic religion of ethics. We have so much in common with that tradition, not the long history and maybe some of the practices, but certainly, that notion of being present and giving the gift of our presence to others.
Yeah.
Are you still connected in any way to Buddhism or find some resonance there?
I am actually. So I lean very Zen, I like to say. So my spiritual mentor is that same person that I interviewed. We've formalized our relationship, so we also speak every Sunday. She gives me koans and so I'm quasi-Zen. I mean, I think there's a resonance there to my spiritual practices,
Another spiritual practice that we've talked about, or I call it kind of a liturgical practice, is poetry. And so we often use poetry here. Certainly the Amanda Gorman poem this morning. When I do a platform address, I very often will begin and end it with a poem, because to me that's very spiritual. You use poetry to circle back to what we were first talking about with your client in the prison, and his poem that he loved the most was the poem "If" by Rudyard Kipling.
Yeah. I think without tradition, and even sometimes the word spiritual can make people uncomfortable that are humanists or non-theists. And so with Phil, there was a challenge to really find what the touch points or the bridge is to spiritual care. So if we don't have scripture, then what are we connecting with as a humanist and as a rational nihilist? Where does one find spiritual connection in that way? Music is certainly a way to do that. Phil was also an avid gardener, And so the thing about Phil too is that he was wickedly smart. He actually did know a lot of scripture, but he used it as a sort of a debating device and not for self-care and comfort. But we could get talking about, he used to work at a nursery and what that was like, and I asked him about plants that I had that, how to take care of them. And so that is one way to connect to this idea of spirituality. He was an avid music lover as well. And so that was another way to connect, and poetry. And so this, in particular, the poem If, really resonated with him because it was, and I wish I had more of it memorized, but it kind of poses this question of equanimity. Like, if it's sort of like equanimity and humility, that there is sort of this middle way between not doing enough and doing too much, and that sort of finding that sweet spot is like the teeter-totter on the playground, right? You have to find, it's not just directly in the middle. You have to, in each of these things that we confront in life, we have to find our own unbalance. And so that was a poem for him that really connected with, he felt as though that he lived in a society that wanted him dead. And so he had to find peace, and that was one way through poetry in which he was able to find some peace.
Interesting. So the poem by Rudyard Kipling, it's sort of like somebody speaking, an older person speaking to a younger person, saying, if you do all these things, if you find these things, then you will be a man, or then you will be a mature person taking your place in society.
Yeah.
Do you think he was trying to find his place in society, or did he feel rejected by society?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he definitely found rejected by society and by some, family. I think that could be the theme of his story was rejection. And I think, as our relationship developed, one of the most powerful things in that relationship was for him just to be seen and accepted. Despite, he did very horrible things and he made tons of very bad decisions. But for me to be there for him in that with no judgment and accepting him, I could see that was the first time that anybody, maybe outside of his mother, really had accepted him in a way that saw him as a person, in spite of doing bad things.
Right. You're reminding me of a documentary some years ago by Eve Ensler, who wrote The Vagina Monologue. She gave writing workshops at Bedford Hills, a prison for women, and the documentary is called What I Want My Words to Do to You. And she had a writing workshop, and the words that the prisoners wrote in her program were then read by leading actresses, and Glenn Close was one of them, so you might recall that. And one of the things, the messages that she wanted to impart in the workshop was that, yes, as you say, you have done terrible things, you've made very bad decisions, and yet you are more than that. You're not the worst thing you have done. You are a person with worth and dignity. And so I'm imagining you were able to reflect that back to Phil and remind him that he was a person of worth and dignity.
Yeah, and in particular in that moment, the moments of his death, his transition, to have someone there that felt that way, I think, meant everything.
So in some ways, you served as his death doula. It's interesting to me that you use the word transition. As a humanist who also does not believe in an afterlife, does not believe in anything, I bristle a little bit at the word transition, and yet when I am in a position with someone who has that belief, I'm going to withhold that judgment. But I'm curious if transition is something is a word or a concept that's meaningful for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think just words in general, spirituality is another one, spiritual care is another one. In my head, transition is transition from life to death. It's not transcendence. And so I think it just really depends on the audience. And again, sort of in the way I use it in my head, it is a sort of the last poetic exhalation of breath is the way I sort of vision it, in my head.
We're going to open it up for questions from all of you and from on Zoom in a little bit. But I'm wondering what next steps do you have in mind? How are you going to continue to practice your vocation as a humanist chaplain? What next steps are ahead?
So I am making a podcast about that entire year with Phil. So that work will begin soon. And then because of the New York Times article, I was fortunate enough to get interest in a book, so I'll be writing a book. The working title is called Something to Believe in, A Skeptic's Guide to Finding Your Big Belief.
Good.
Because I do feel, and I don't know if this is just my gut telling me this, or if there's some other intuition or some facts that I've read that like, this congregation, people, although they may not believe in God, I still think that there is an inherent desire in the human condition to want to believe in something bigger than oneself. And I think one of, if I may say, the issues with America, at least right now, is that this over-indexing on self-determination and individualism is not only bad for society, but I don't think it's in our human nature. And so what I hope to do is to through my experiences, to maybe present options for people that were like me 10 years ago, that were searching, and that you can't actually have faith without needing to think magically.
Yeah, thank you. My last question is actually in the form of, I guess, an invitation to join us more often. And we've been talking about, and I'm going to again repeat my gratitude to Angel and to Sarah for convening on Wednesday a Zoom meeting for folks who were kind of disconcerted, grieving, choose the word for the emotion, on Wednesday after this election. And so how do we move forward? So I shared with you, and I'll share later with all of you, what I thought was an excellent article from Nicholas Kristof called A Manifesto on Moving Forward. I'm wondering if you have any words of advice for us, or some way that can help us with our next steps, because that's something that we're grappling with. And also, we currently do not have a clergy leader here. Other ethical societies, other congregations have issued statements. As you know, we are a lot in our heads, we in ethical culture, so we love words. We love to get those statements out there. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that we didn't have a statement, because I think that we can discuss the good or bad of that, but I think that we've been sitting with our feelings since Wednesday and trying to understand where to go with that. So we're grappling with what those next steps would be. So any advice, maybe advice that you've given yourself that might be helpful?
I think stay in the grapple constantly. I think this idea of wrestle or to dance with it is appropriate, because it's ever moving, and you will be influenced by it. And so then the question is how will you influence back? And it's sort of give and take. And this also the idea of needing to get over grief. I would also maybe just suggest that be in it, whatever you're feeling, for as long as you need to be in it. And then maybe the last thing, which is, great about your organization, is that you have values. And so really find those values that resonate with you the most, and make them yours in a way, and let the values be your guide, and let them show you how to do that dance, that very uncomfortable grappling with the world in which we now live, that we are going to have to be involved with, and it's going to require our hearts, and it's going to require our action. And so now would be the time to align with values and be in the discomfort and let that teach you.
Thank you. Tachi, I'm going to ask you to take the hand mic from Devin so that people might have questions. I'm going to swing this over your way. Questions from you, and I'll be checking Pat. You'll let me know if anybody.
If I heard you, I'm sorry, somebody else is talking? Oh, if I heard you correctly, you were working with a condemned person, and you helped him move along that pathway as best you could. When I worked in prisons, I have found that most of the people in prison have never had anybody who really recognized them for themselves, and a lot of their behavior pattern is acting out against that. But having said all that, as a country, we're facing people unleashed. That's a very different ballgame, and I'm just wondering, when you were out there in the Midwest, which the people on the East Coast call the flyover country, okay, were you able to engage with any of the ministers of the so-called Christian faith in terms of I don't know what I could call their combination of thought is, but certainly runs counter to humanism in many, many ways. What was your experience there?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, because what that brings up in me is that relationship more often than not wasn't adversarial. So a lot of the death penalty abolitionists are Christian organizations. And a lot of the people that stand in front of the prisons on the execution day are clergy. And so it's important that, as a humanist, it's certainly not in us against them as far as religion and Christians. And believe it or not, most of the churches are against capital punishment. And so it's trickles down from belief systems from, the legislators and the judicial branch. But my experience was that most of the advocacy against capital punishment was driven by Christian-specific churches.
Hi, Devin. My name is Vernon.
Hi, Vernon.
I came late, but I just wanted, I don't have a question for you, but I just want to say something. Words cannot adequately convey my gratitude for your appearance and your sharing. I think it's very, very important in these times in which we're facing right now, because we're internalizing a lot, and the trick, I think, is you can't manipulate true commitment and love, and that's what we're going to really have to pull together to do, because I think the basis of true spirituality is just doing the right thing for the right reason and not expecting nothing in return. That's like holding the door open for an old lady and not expecting her to say thank you. Simple things like that, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Devin, for this talk. My first adult years was working in the courts and the prisons. And in the Women's House of the, more so than in the tombs, like you shared, the question was always, what's next? But with the women, the conversation always came around suicide. And I know in the Black tradition, where I was raised, that it was supposed to be a sin to take your life. But then we found out that that was really because our lives were not ours, and it belonged to the overseer, the master. So my question to you is, was it those early years of Constantine that made that a law, or where did that come from?
To take your own life as a sin?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it is traditionally a Catholic belief, at least from the way it now sort of permeates through society. And I will say, even though I just said it's not us against them, in my last question, there is a lot of talk, and you'll see it on a few states' legislation about giving people the right to end their life, particularly if they're terminal. And what I learned with that is that the lobbyists that always try to squash that legislation is the Catholic Church. So the history of it, I'm not entirely clear all the ins and outs, but I do know that and I can't speak of sort of all of the different political and manipulative reasons why that sort of grew, and not to say that it was a disingenuous belief. But yeah, it today it is predominantly it derives from Catholicism.
Yeah, I just been trying to get to their root.
It's very interesting to pray, to consider where ownership, who owns whose body, that
And
suicide becomes
and
a sin.
soul, yeah.
And soul. I'm so moved by your talk, and thank you for bringing Dean to this conversation. And I learned of you through the article in the New York Times as well. I grapple with a few things. I'll end with a question, but the grappling is, being an abolitionist, what does that mean? A lot of my colleagues and comrades and friends are abolitionists. And I pay attention to that, where like, if we want to undo punishment, we have to undo all the harm that came before it. So it's really a social construct of harm and pain, and it locks so hard into forgiveness, but also care. A society that doesn't care for people do bad things, harm others. And so I think of hospice care, and having been close to a few people as they died, watching them need to reconcile some things. And I imagine that's not so different, although maybe tremendously different, from one who's on death row, but still accompanying someone towards the end of their life is so profound. I feel a calling for it, actually. So we have a life and death discussion group out of our congregation that meets once a month, and I'm always very moved when I get to attend. And I think my question really is, how did you make this change? So it sounds like when I think about your life, there was a life before you became a humanist chaplain. There was like a moment where you had aha and you went in that direction. And I'm curious what made you make that change. Well, you said what made you make that change. Maybe it's what you did before, and what you advise for people who might want to move towards that intimate space of being a death doula.
I would say, for me, it was many steps along the way. There was a gravitational force that I just felt didn't make sense. I think when you know you're in a flow, you know you're in a flow, and trust that is what I would offer. And it was picking up the phone and calling Anne, and then she introduced me to somebody else, and then it was just this kind of like, here, let me help you with 1,000 hands. And so I offer that. However I can help you, I will. And if you're feeling that calling, then trust it.
Okay. And thanks for bringing DS Moss today and for presiding so beautifully. And Devin, thanks for joining us. I also was very moved by the article in the Times. I'm sure that catapulted a lot of attention towards you. And I was just very impressed with Phil's character, that he advocated for himself to have a humanist chaplain as opposed to, nobody, or accepting a Christian priest or a preacher. And I'm wondering, is this a single event, or is there any kind of movement within the carceral system to open up both for humanist chaplaincy on a regular basis for the general population and for counseling for other inmates who are facing the end of their life through, illness or the death penalty?
The short answer is no. There's no movements, and I don't say that to be funny, because particularly with the in-prison chaplains, the one that get paid to be there, are only Christian. There's no Buddhist chaplains. There's no imams. At least in Oklahoma. Again, it really varies state to state. There are movements for palliative care, sort of modernized palliative care in prison systems, which is nice to see. But it is as I'm sure everybody knows, it is a hard go to get any change and any sort of compassion into that system. As a volunteer, it is their, if they're on death row in the state of Oklahoma, it is their constitutional right to choose whatever clergy they want to. Many probably don't realize that, or aren't told that that is their constitutional right. Again, Phil did have agency, and he did read quite a bit. So I would offer it, and also the volunteers. Like, I was talking to the head chaplain of Department of Corrections, and he said it was a pretty staggering stat. Like 95% of prison volunteers come from faith-based organizations, which is great. I think the more volunteers, the better. But that it's saying like, okay, so we're the 5%. Let's grow. Let's change that dynamic so that it's not just faith-based, it's compassion-based.
I can add something to that. There is some good news, not much, but some. The American Humanist Association, and we are associated with them, this congregation, does reach out to prisoners and sends them literature. So, and one of the reasons I know this is not only because I'm a member of the AHA and on their council, but my daughter, Emily Newman, working with the Center for Education, actually packs up that material and sends it to prisoners in US prisons. Not a lot, but more people, as they learn about humanism, as they learn about the American Humanist Association, they are reaching out. And every week, Emily sends out more material to yet another prison. So, a drop in the bucket, but nonetheless. And there are the American Humanist Association, the Center for Education, also has a group called the Humanist Society, and that is a collection of humanist officiants and chaplains The training is not rigorous, alas, but certainly we are rigorous in terms of who we accept for certification by the AHA or by the Humanist Society. So some progress, albeit slow. So any other questions? And Pat, does anyone have a question online? I'm looking around, I don't see any hands, but I want to make sure that we don't leave anyone out.
No questions on Zoom.
Okay. Any closing words for us, Stefan? I give you the last word. And I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, I'm trying to get there the shortest way I can. I think one of the things that I took away from the experience with Phil was, that, as I said, we have the legislator making the decisions, we have the judicial systems sending out the sentences, but the people that actually do the executions are, the corrections officers, and so it's citizens. And what happens, it was very clear to me, what happens is that as a society, when we kill somebody as punishment, in those moments, that violence ripples right back out to society. So the idea of that it's solving anything, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think there's something very profound in sort of underscoring the question of who do we want to be as a society? What is our aspirational version of humanity? And it's not an easy question to answer, and it's filled with complexity, but in those moments, you can see the way it affects the children and the communities. And so I would just offer sort of the flashing neon light that sort of keeps me going is, who do we want to be?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Devin. And make sure that goes into the book.